The world had always felt solid, immutable beneath the feet of humanity. Even as the whispers began, faint at first, carried on the frigid winds from the high latitudes, most dismissed them as the bleating of alarmists or the natural ebb and flow of a planet too vast and ancient to be swayed by the transient activities of its dominant, self-appointed species. Dr. Aris Thorne, however, heard the whispers as a growing roar. From his cramped, sensor-laden outpost perched precariously on a newly exposed ridge in what was once the heart of the great Alaskan ice fields, he watched the glaciers not just recede, but seemingly stretch. It was a terrifying concept, one his peers had initially scoffed at, clinging to the comforting simplicity of existing models. They understood melting, calving, the simple physics of ice turning to water. But Aris, with his arrays of interferometric radar, deep Earth seismic monitors, and satellite-linked geodetic arrays, was seeing something more insidious, more profound, a fundamental, almost agonizing redistribution of mass. It was a continental groan as billions upon billions of tons of ice vanished, not merely evaporating into the atmosphere or flowing into the sea, but removing an unimaginable load from the very lithosphere. The land beneath, suddenly unburdened, began to rebound, to shudder, to reconfigure itself in ways no one had fully anticipated. The Earth, it seemed, was not merely shedding a superficial layer. It was being contorted by its absence, like an ancient, weary body finally letting go of a colossal weight, only to find its musculature had atrophied and its bones were brittle from the long encumbrance. He remembered the early reports, abstract data points on flickering screens that had once been the sole domain of specialized journals and niche conferences. Greenland's ice sheet was hemorrhaging ice at a rate accelerating by the decade, 7 times faster than in the relative quiescence of the 1990s. Then, there was Antarctica's Leviathan, Thwaites, the so-called Doomsday Glacier, not merely retreating but exhibiting strange, chaotic internal rifts, as if its very molecular structure was being torn asunder by unseen forces. Its grounded ice was thinning and retreating from the bedrock at an alarming pace, threatening a multi-meter sea level rise that would redraw every coastline on the planet. These were not just statistics for Aris. They were symptoms of a profound planetary malady, a fever building to a catastrophic crescendo. The consensus models, once so meticulously crafted and peer-reviewed, had become quaint, utterly inadequate to describe the violent contortions of the cryosphere. The ice, once a titanic, patient sculptor of mountains and valleys, had become a vengeful spirit in its dissolution, tearing at the very geological foundations it had shaped over millennia. The crust, suddenly unburdened by unimaginable weight, buckled and warped, not gently, with the slow, almost imperceptible creeping of tectonic plates, but with a series of deep, guttural seismic coughs that rippled across continents, sending tremors through the very bedrock of human civilization. New fault lines began to appear, not along ancient sutures, but in unexpected places, through the hearts of supposedly stable landmasses, fracturing bedrock that had known only the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates for eons. The concept of isostatic rebound, once a dry academic term, had become a terrifying, active verb. The first major jolt came not from the Pacific Ring of Fire, that notorious girdle of geological unrest, but from the seemingly placid heart of the Canadian Shield, a vast, ancient bedrock considered to be seismically dead, a bastion of continental stability. A magnitude 8. One quake, shallow and devastating, ripped through northern Quebec, annihilating nascent attempts at tundra reclamation, unleashing an apocalyptic cascade of permafrost collapse. Miles of ancient boreal forest, already skeletal from climate stress and relentless wildfires, simply liquefied, swallowed by vast sinkholes that belched forth a fetid mix of methane and primordial swamp gas, a reeking breath from the planet's buried past. The methane, a greenhouse accelerator many times more potent than carbon dioxide, fueled the rapid unraveling, creating a terrifying feedback loop, a planet devouring itself from the inside out, its own biological systems turning against it in a desperate fever dream. Aris, watching the real-time seismic readouts from his remote station, had seen the unique signature of the event, not a classic plate slip, but a deep, violent elastic rebound, the land springing upward with the force of a coiled spring finally released, shattering the brittle surface above. This was the stretching in action, the Earth's lithosphere recoiling from the removal of its icy burden, tearing itself apart in the process, exposing raw, unstable fissures where once solid ground had been. The oceans, too, bore the brunt of this glacial agony. The vast, unprecedented influx of freshwater, chilling and diluting the dense, saline currents of the North Atlantic, began to stutter the mighty thermohaline conveyor belt, the global ocean current system that regulated planetary climate. This system, carrying warmth from the equator towards the poles and distributing nutrients throughout the marine ecosystem, was faltering. The Gulf Stream, once a warm river of life flowing north, began to weaken, to eddy, to churn with an unnatural sluggishness. Its powerful flow diminished to a trickle in places, diverted in others. Europe, once anticipating the slow, insidious heat death of the South, found itself plunged into an era of unpredictable, brutal winters. Blizzards so fierce swallowed entire cities in drifts of snow and ice, only to be followed by brief, scorching summers that melted the accumulated snow into flash floods. These floods stripped away what little topsoil remained and inundated coastal towns that had already weathered decades of relentless sea level rise. The equilibrium was gone, replaced by a chaotic pendulum swing between extremes, a planet experiencing its own self-inflicted thermal shock. Fish populations, disoriented and starved by the shifting temperatures and salinities, died en masse, their bloated, iridescent corpses littering shorelines for miles. This further polluted the already struggling ecosystems, choking the very breath from the coastal air. The intricate web of life, woven over millennia with such delicate precision, began to unravel with terrifying speed, strand by excruciating strand. As the physical world distorted, so too did the human spirit. The initial denial, once a comfortable blanket of ignorance, gave way to a desperate, often violent, scramble for dwindling resources. Water, once a birthright, a freely flowing gift from the heavens, became a currency more valuable than gold, than a weapon, than a mere memory in the parched throats of millions. Migratory crises exploded across every continent as populations fled not just coastal inundation, but also the brutal, unending Arctic winters descending upon temperate zones, or the rapid desertification of once fertile plains. The borders, once sacrosanct lines on maps enforced by bristling military might, dissolved under the relentless pressure of millions seeking refuge, only to find few places left untouched by the planet's profound upheaval. Governments, already teetering under the cumulative weight of unmanageable debt, internal dissent, and the sheer scale of the unfolding disaster, crumbled. The grand, interconnected systems of trade and communication fractured, leaving isolated pockets of humanity to fend for themselves, often descending into a brutal Hobbesian existence where trust was a luxury, cooperation a rare and fragile thing, and survival the only creed. The carefully constructed edifice of civilization, built on the illusion of stability and progress, began to crack and splinter, revealing the raw, primal fear and desperation that lay just beneath its veneer. There were those, of course, who tried to find answers, to offer solace amidst the accelerating decay. The old faiths, once comforting pillars of morality and meaning, seemed to buckle under the strain of a God-given world gone so terribly wrong, their sacred texts offering little guidance for an earth that was literally tearing itself apart. New cults emerged from the fertile ground of despair, promising salvation through arcane rituals, or condemning humanity for its perceived transgressions against a wrathful planet, a cosmic reckoning for sins beyond measure. Prophecies of doom, once confined to dusty, overlooked tomes, became terrifyingly real, whispered in the streets, shouted from makeshift pulpits in the ruins of churches and public squares. And then there were the scientists like Aris, those relentless seekers of truth who continued their work amidst the chaos, driven by a grim determination to understand, even if understanding offered no salvation, no reversal of the terrible course. They tracked the new fault lines, the burgeoning sinkholes that swallowed entire villages overnight, the accelerating melt, the strange, low-frequency hums that emanated from the newly exposed bedrock. These sounds seemed to be the planet itself crying out in pain, or perhaps in the terrible silence of its dying. The most disturbing phenomenon, however, was the profound psychological toll. A pervasive malaise, a sense of profound hopelessness, settled over the remnants of humanity like a shroud. The beauty of the world, once a source of inspiration and solace, was now twisted into something grotesque, towering tsunamis that devoured what remained of coastal cities. Vast stretches of land turned into poisoned marshes from failed seawalls, skies perpetually choked with dust from the collapsing permafrost, and the wildfires that raged unchecked in the desiccated forests, their smoke staining the very atmosphere. The very air carried a tangible sorrow, a weight that crushed the spirit and extinguished the will to fight. Children born into this broken world knew no other reality. Their eyes, once bright with innocence, held an ancient weariness, a knowledge of loss that no previous generation had ever had to bear. They lived in the shadow of the stretching, the constant, unsettling tremor beneath their feet, the unpredictable fury of the weather, the memory of a world that once was, passed down like a ghost story, a fragile, fading myth by their elders. The very concept of a stable future had evaporated, replaced by a day-to-day struggle for bare existence, a life lived on the precipice of absolute uncertainty. Aris often found himself staring at the vast, desolate expanse where the colossal glacier once stood. He remembered old satellite images, faint outlines of white against gray, now replaced by a jagged, fractured landscape, scarred with new chasms of impossible depth, fissured by the Earth's restless adjustments. He had been a proponent of caution, an evangelist for foresight, a voice crying in the wilderness. He had presented his data, clear and undeniable, to committees filled with men and women in tailored suits who spoke of economic growth, of political expediency, of the need for consensus and compromise, of the inconvenience of change. They had praised his diligence, patted him on the shoulder, and then continued down the path of least resistance, convinced that technology would always find a solution, that the planet was resilient enough to absorb any abuse, that the future was always tomorrow, never today. Their short-sightedness had not been malicious, perhaps, but it had been a fatal blindness, a failure of imagination so profound it had sealed the fate of millions, turning the promise of tomorrow into the nightmare of today. The last great tremor, the one they now simply called the Great Shudder, had come a month ago, a global vibration that had lasted for nearly an hour. It had been an event of unprecedented scale, not a single epicenter, but a vast, diffuse oscillation emanating from beneath the ancient glacial beds of Antarctica and Greenland, as if the very poles of the Earth were adjusting, groaning under a new, terrible weight distribution. Aris's instruments had screamed, their needles slamming against their stops, then gone silent, overloaded by the sheer energetic output. His station had bucked like a ship in a typhoon. When the static cleared and the auxiliary power kicked in, the world was subtly, irrevocably different. The sun seemed brighter, harsher, its light cutting through a perpetually hazy atmosphere. The sky, where visible through the particulate matter, was a more intense, almost violent blue. The land around his outpost had shifted, the ridge he stood on now angled at a disturbing tilt, exposing new strata of rock that had not seen the light of day for geological epochs. The air was thinner, colder, yet carried a strange metallic tang, a smell of pulverized rock and something indefinably alien. It was as if the planet had finally shrugged, resettling its weary bones, but in doing so had irrevocably altered its posture, its gait, its very being, forever changing its relationship with the void of space. In the quiet aftermath, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound, Aris had walked for miles, surveying the new landscape. He found a fragment of an ancient moraine, a smooth, rounded stone that had been polished by millennia of glacial movement, a relic from a lost age. He picked it up, feeling its cold, solid weight, a tangible link to a world that was utterly gone, submerged beneath a tide of irreversible change. The irony was bitter. Almost unbearable humanity had feared the melt, the slow drowning of the coasts, the predictable rise of the tides, the inexorable creep of the warming seas. They had prepared for water, for floods, for the familiar consequences of a warmer world, building defenses, relocating cities, dreaming of grand geoengineering solutions. But they had not prepared for the stretching, for the Earth's visceral reaction to the sudden, cataclysmic removal of its icy sheath, for the geological convulsions, the continental spasms, the profound rebalancing of forces that had reshaped the very continents. The ice had been more than just frozen water. It had been a foundational element, a stabilizer, a gigantic, silent anchor for the planet's crust, a colossal weight that had held the very ground firm. Without it, the world was adrift, twisting and turning under its own immense, unburdened weight, a cosmic dancer thrown off balance. He thought of the words of the old writers, The ones who spoke of hubris, of mankind's relentless drive to conquer, to control, to extract without heed for consequence, their narratives echoing through the fractured air. They had warned of an inner darkness, a spiritual blindness that preceded destruction, a turning away from the sacredness of creation. But the destruction that had come was not just spiritual. It was profoundly physical, a testament to the undeniable truth that the earth was not a passive canvas for human ambition, but a living, breathing entity, capable of reacting with a terrifying, indifferent power when pushed beyond its limits. The glaciers had not merely melted. They had, in their agonizing retreat, torn at the very fabric of the world, leaving behind a scarred, fractured testament to a planetary body that had finally recoiled from the hand that sought to master it. The silence that now permeated the vast, empty landscapes was not peaceful. It was the heavy silence of consequence, the profound quiet of a world that had stretched itself to the breaking point, and in doing so, had broken itself beyond repair, leaving only a memory of its former grace. The cautionary tale was not just in the warming, but in the unseen, profound unraveling of the Earth's deepest physical bonds, a stretching of its very substance that humanity, in its arrogant short-sightedness, had mistakenly believed would never happen or could be somehow controlled. This was the new normal, a constant, unsettling reminder of the price paid for an unbridled ambition that failed to grasp the delicate, intricate balance of the world it inhabited, a balance forged over eons. And in the thin, frigid air, Aris could almost hear the earth sighing, a long, weary exhalation that carried the dust of a broken promise and the chilling echoes of a future that had already arrived. The new dawn was stark, alien, illuminated by a sun that cast long, unforgiving shadows across a landscape utterly transformed by the glacial stretch. It was a world reborn, yes, but reborn from the ashes of its own violent deconstruction, a monument to a species that had learned too late that some balances, once disturbed, can never be restored. The silence of the stretched earth was the loudest warning of all. Its vast, empty spaces now held only the truth that the true measure of a civilization is not in its monuments, but in its wisdom to live in harmony with the only home it has, a wisdom humanity had tragically failed to acquire. The tremors were less frequent now, but each one served as a reminder, a deep, resonant chord struck in the Earth's broken heart, of the colossal error that had redefined existence itself.